You're too old to get involved in these things. Just accept that your time has passed. Those were the last words I heard from my daughter before she slammed the door in my face. It wasn't out of anger or in the middle of a fight. It was just indifference. As if I had become an old piece of furniture, ready to be thrown out. That night, I sat on the bench at the corner park, still holding the grocery bag in my hands, and realized that no one would even notice if I simply disappeared. And that's exactly what I decided to do. What if I told you that vanishing was the best decision of my life? Stay with me until the end of this story. What happened next will make you rethink everything about family, self-worth, and starting over. My name is Helen. I'm 62 years old, and I spent most of my life trying to be everything to everyone. A present mother, a devoted wife, a loving grandmother, an understanding mother-in-law. I didn't have dreams of traveling the world or becoming anything grand. My dream was simple: to be needed. To matter. When my husband died suddenly from a heart attack at 49, something inside me froze. I didn't get to grieve properly. There were bills to pay. A funeral to plan. Emily needed help with the kids, and Michael was too far away. So I pushed the pain aside and threw myself into being useful. The glue that held what was left of the family together. Emily, my daughter, was always pragmatic. Cold, even. She scheduled everything, love included. Her children knew when it was hug time and when it was quiet hour. She ran her home like a corporation. And in that corporation, I was the unpaid intern, called in when someone was sick, or dinner needed to be made, or the school forgot to send lunch notices. Michael, my eldest, lived a few states away. He had a good job, a small family of his own. But the distance between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He called on birthdays and holidays, always apologizing for not calling sooner. But deep down, I stopped expecting anything more. Still, I showed up. Always. I was the extra pair of hands. The emergency contact. The one who remembered everyone's favorite meals and the sizes of their shoes. I helped pay for school supplies when money was tight, fixed hems on dresses, brought over casseroles during flu season. And in return, I wasn't thanked. I was tolerated. At first, it was subtle. A sigh when I offered advice. An eye roll when I brought handmade gifts. But over time, it grew sharper. My presence became something they endured. My calls were sent to voicemail more often. My hugs became awkward. My place in their lives felt more like a shadow. Until that day. The day I brought over a roasted chicken to Emily's house. I knew she'd been busy, the kids had after-school activities, and I just wanted to help. The meal was hot, the skin golden, the kitchen towel still wrapped around the tray. She opened the door and stared at me like I was a stranger selling something. "Mom, no one asked for this. I've already told you, don't come over unannounced." My heart dropped. I stood there, holding that chicken like it was a peace offering she never wanted. The smell of rosemary and garlic mixed with something bitter in my throat, shame. I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to say I only wanted to help, but before I could form a single word, she hit me with something far worse. "You're too old to get involved in these things. Just accept that your time has passed." The words didn't come out as a whisper. They were firm. Final. Like a door closing. I stood still, frozen in that moment, while she turned her back and walked inside, leaving the door half closed. The chicken trembled in my hands. Not because it was heavy, but because I finally understood. I wasn't part of their lives anymore. And then came the silence. The worst kind of silence. The silence of exclusion. I went back home alone. My place was a small apartment I'd inherited from my mother. Nothing fancy. Old furniture, crocheted curtains, plants on the balcony that I talked to more than people. It was small, worn, but it was mine. My safe little cave, even if it sometimes felt like a cage. I set the roasted chicken on the table and sat in my usual chair by the window. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the floor. And suddenly, everything broke. I cried. Not silent tears, deep, guttural sobs that came from somewhere buried inside me. It wasn't sadness over the meal or even Emily's words. It was grief. Grief for the woman I used to be. For the years I had given away like pennies in a jar, never keeping a single one for myself. That night, I didn't eat. I sat there for hours, the chicken untouched, the house unbearably quiet. And for the first time, I didn't feel lonely, I felt invisible. In the days that followed, I waited for something. A phone call. A knock on the door. A message from Michael. Anything. But there was nothing. Emily's only contact came a week later. Did you remember to pay the internet bill? That was it. No, how are you? No, are you okay? Just another request. Another reminder that I was no longer seen as a person, but as a utility. That's when it hit me, like a slap across the face, I was useful, but not loved. Valued only for what I could do, not for who I was. Not for what I had lived, or felt, or lost. I started to see my life as if it belonged to someone else. Every photo on the wall looked like a lie. A smiling mother, a beaming grandmother, but behind those eyes? Exhaustion. Silence. Erasure. Was this it? Was this the great reward for a life of sacrifice? To be discarded like a threadbare coat. One evening, I stood in the center of my living room and turned slowly in place, looking at everything I owned. And I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask. What if I left it all behind? That question didn't frighten me. It set me free. So I began. Quietly. Carefully. I sold the antique lamp from the hallway. Then the bookshelf. Then the table. I packed memories into boxes and donated them to strangers. I emptied closets and drawers, keeping only what I truly needed. I made a list. I checked my pension. I sold the old sedan I barely drove anymore. And when I looked at the total in my bank account, meager as it was, I didn't see fear. I saw possibility. For the first time in decades, I had something that wasn't tied to anyone else. I had freedom. And with trembling hands and a hopeful heart, I used that freedom to buy a one-way ticket to the Pacific Northwest. The bus ride took over 2 days. I didn't tell a soul. Not even Michael. My phone stayed off the entire journey, tucked deep in my purse like a relic of a past life. I watched the country unfold outside the window like a film, empty fields turning into pine-covered hills, then winding rivers and sleepy towns. Each mile put more distance between me and the version of myself that had spent decades waiting to be noticed. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I wasn't needed by anyone. And in that quiet, unfamiliar freedom, I felt a strange peace settle over me. When the bus finally pulled into the station, I stepped down with a suitcase in one hand and a paper map in the other. I'd chosen the town almost at random. Something about its name sounded gentle. Safe. The kind of place where no one knew my name. And that was exactly what I needed. The salty scent of the ocean hit me first. Not the artificial ocean breeze smell from candles or air fresheners. Real sea air, raw and wild, tinged with pine and driftwood. The streets were narrow and quiet. Wind chimes danced on porches. Wooden signs creaked over shop entrances. Life moved slowly there, like the tide. I felt like I'd stepped into a different world. I found a small room for rent above a used bookstore on the corner of Main and Pine. The bookstore owner, Nora, looked like someone who had lived 100 lives and still had fire in her eyes. Short silver hair, calloused hands, and a laugh that echoed like bells. "You runnin' from something or running to something?" she asked as she handed me the spare key. "Maybe both," I said, surprised by my own honesty. She gave a crooked smile. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." My room was small, barely big enough for a bed, a desk, and a narrow closet, but it had a window that looked out over the rooftops, and at night, I could hear the distant sound of waves. I didn't have a plan. Just instincts. I walked the streets aimlessly, ran my fingers across handmade soaps and wooden bowls at the market, sat on benches by the dock just to feel the breeze on my face. And little by little, I started to breathe again, not just air, but life. Money, of course, was tight. I had enough saved for a few months of rent, groceries, and little else. I kept a small notebook where I recorded every expense down to the penny. I avoided eating out, skipped anything that wasn't essential, and walked everywhere to save on bus fare. There were nights I stared at the ceiling wondering what I'd done. I didn't have a resume that made sense to modern employers. No formal degrees. No certifications. Just decades of unpaid care work, raising kids, cooking meals, managing crises, and being the backbone no one ever acknowledged. Work that didn't count on paper, but had kept lives together. One gray afternoon, I was walking back from the grocery store when a faded flyer taped to a lamppost caught my eye. "Part-time kitchen help needed, seniors welcome. Community center. No experience required." My feet moved before I had time to second guess. The community center was a cheerful brick building with flower beds at the entrance and handwritten posters taped to every door. Inside, I found warmth, not just from the heating vents, but from the people. Laughter echoed from a nearby room. Children ran through the halls. And from the kitchen, the smell of onions sizzling in butter drifted out like a welcome. Behind the counter stood a man in his early 60s, tall, with silver curls under a worn baseball cap and an apron dusted with flour. His name was Carl. "You cook?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. I hesitated. "I've been cooking my whole life. Just not for pay." He smiled. "Even better. You don't come with bad restaurant habits. Start tomorrow." And just like that, I had a job. The work was tough. Heavy pots, early mornings, standing for hours. My back screamed some nights, and my hands, so used to gentler tasks, grew red and cracked from constant washing. But I didn't care. Because for the first time in what felt like forever, I was doing something that mattered. Not to survive someone else's life, but to shape my own. I made friends, women like me, survivors of heartbreak, neglect, abandonment. We bonded over soup pots and shared glances that said, "I see you." We swapped stories over chopped carrots and dishwater. Widowhood. Divorce. Grown children who forgot birthdays. And we laughed. Oh, how we laughed. Still, the fear crept in at night. What if this didn't work out? What if I got sick? What if I spent the last of my money and couldn't pay rent? What if Emily tracked me down and tried to guilt me back into the life I'd escaped? Some nights, those thoughts wrapped around my chest like a vice. But then I'd remind myself, I had already lived through the worst, through invisibility, through erasure. At least now, I had a name again. People said, "Hi Helen," when I walked in. Carl saved me the good apron. Children waved at me when they passed by the kitchen. I had rhythm. I had purpose. And that was more than I'd had in years. Months passed. Seasons shifted. And slowly, so did I. With some savings from my job at the community center and a generous offer from Nora's neighbor, I moved into a small weathered cabin by the water. It had chipped blue shutters, creaky wooden floors, and a fireplace that smoked a little when the wind blew east. But it also had something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The first morning I woke up there, I opened the window and cried. Not out of sadness, but because I had woken up to something that felt like freedom. The scent of the ocean drifted in through the curtains, and the sound of seagulls became my new morning alarm. I began baking again. Not just out of necessity, but out of joy. Old family recipes I hadn't touched in decades started coming back to me like old friends. Apple pies with buttery crusts, soft rolls with rosemary, sticky cinnamon buns that melted in your mouth. I brought a small batch to the weekend market just to see what would happen. By noon, they were gone. The next week, people came back asking for more. Are you the one who made those hand pies? Got any of that banana bread again? Soon, they were calling me Miss Helen, the pie lady. And with that title came something unexpected: belonging. Not out of obligation. Not out of guilt. But because I brought something real to the table. I'd dance to old jazz records while cleaning the cabin. Scribble poems on napkins while waiting for dough to rise. I planted herbs in little pots and placed them on my windowsill. I got used to walking into town and hearing, "Morning, Helen," like I'd lived there all my life. And I started to feel something I hadn't in so long that I almost didn't recognize it. I started to feel whole. One crisp Saturday morning, Nora stopped by my booth at the market. She looked at me with that knowing twinkle in her eye and said, "You're glowing, you know. Whatever you lost before, you found something better." I smiled, wiping flour from my apron. "I didn't find something," I said. "I became it." She nodded once, slowly. "That's the trick, isn't it?" And that, I realized, was the quiet, golden truth of starting over, not to recover who you were, but to build who you were always meant to become. It was a chilly afternoon in November when the past came knocking, not at my door, but through a notification. I was packaging cinnamon rolls for a regular customer when I checked the market's Facebook page. A message had come in. "Are you alive?" No greeting. No punctuation. Just 3 hollow words. The sender, Emily. I froze. Not from fear, but from the eerie realization that I hadn't heard from her in nearly a year, and this was the first thing she thought to say. Later that evening, I listened to a voicemail from Michael. "Mom, Emily says you disappeared. What's going on? We need to talk." Disappeared? I thought. No, I just stopped existing in their orbit. I didn't vanish. I reclaimed. I let the silence stretch. I waited. And sure enough, 3 days later, a message came from my grandson, barely a teenager. "Grandma, can we borrow $1,500? We're behind on rent. Emily said you probably have it." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Not a word about how I was. Not a question. Just expectation. Assumption. Entitlement. I didn't reply. A week later, while I was restocking pies at the Saturday market, a familiar figure appeared across the stall. Emily. She hadn't changed much, same rigid posture, same impatient eyes. But I had changed. And that made all the difference. "Mom," she said softly, like we'd just spoken yesterday. "Can we talk?" I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I'm working." She followed me behind the booth, her voice lower now, tinged with rehearsed softness. "You can't seriously still be mad at us." I folded a paper bag, placed it neatly on the counter, and turned to her. "I'm not mad, Emily. I just realized I don't have to be anyone's doormat. Not anymore." She blinked, taken aback. Like the rules had changed and no one told her. "So what, you're just cutting us off?" I tilted my head. "No. I'm just choosing me. For once." Her expression hardened. She turned and walked off, her heels clacking angrily against the pavement. And for the first time in years, as I stood there under a canopy of orange leaves and wood smoke in the air, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. Winter melted into spring, and with it, something shifted inside me. Not dramatically. Not with fireworks. But quietly, like thawed earth softening beneath your feet. I began hosting community baking classes at the center. It started small, just a few curious seniors who missed kneading dough, then a couple of teenage girls from the nearby high school, and soon enough, we had a full room every Thursday evening. Single moms, retirees, lonely widowers, even a few dads who'd never baked before. We didn't just learn recipes, we shared stories, laughter, and second chances. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just giving, I was receiving too. Smiles. Gratitude. Connection. Identity. One evening, after a particularly joyful class, Carl and I sat side by side on a bench overlooking the bay. The sky was painted in strokes of peach and violet, and the breeze carried the scent of rising tide. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, his voice gentle. I looked out at the water. "I didn't leave a home, Carl. I left a cage." He nodded, his lips curled in that easy smile of his. "Well, you've built something real here. Something better." And he was right. Now, I wake up with the sun pouring through the curtains and the sound of gulls calling across the shore. My hands still ache from long baking days, but my heart doesn't. I walk barefoot in the sand. I read under tall pine trees. I spend Sundays laughing over tea with people who've become more family than my blood ever was. They don't care how old I am. They care that I show up. And maybe that's what we all need, not youth, not perfection, but to be seen. To be heard. To be loved not for what we do, but for who we choose to become. Not everyone gets a second chapter. But I did. And this time, I'm writing every word of it myself. Never forget this, it's never too late to start over. To choose yourself. To become the person you were meant to be all along. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who needs this reminder. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories like this one. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you had a second chance to start fresh? Because maybe, just maybe, that chance starts today. Thanks for watching.